โมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening to you all. A couple of days ago was the beginning of spring here in Melbourne. Coincided with a couple of days of very warm, unusually warm weather, which often brings out those creatures who've been hibernating, monks as well, tend to come out into the open when it warms up. And we always get a few snakes coming out when it's hot in the spring. They've been waiting for the hot days. So we had one tiger snake come and sunbathe in front of the eating hall. And that day was also a day we remember one of our teachers, Lumpu Supa, who passed away on that day, 2nd of September, about 6 years ago. Lumpu means venerable grandfather. And when he died, Lumpu Supa was 118 years old. So, a very old and venerable monk, and he had even had evidence of his date of birth. He had a monk's certificate book. And it's always, even though it's sad to lose great teachers who are inspiring in their lives and their practice, it's also a happy memory and a happy reflection to reflect on their lives and the good of their lives. And particularly the venerable older members of the Sangha are very important for Buddhism because they have dedicated their lives to the practice and realization of the Dhamma, just as we chanted with the Dhammacakka Sutta, and to the realization of the Four Noble Truths, and particularly monastics, monks and nuns, who live their whole life more or less in the robes. They've developed a great sense of renunciation and sacrifice for the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, which is a vital, essential part of the world, and a resource for the world. Lumpu Supa, he ordained as a novice monk when he was 9 years old. So he lived in the robes from the age of 9 till the age of 118, so 109 years of monastic life, which is something I remind people of when they've been in the monastery a few days or a few weeks and are finding it tough. I say, well, Lumpu was in the monastery for 109 years. So you can imagine he went through every kind of problem and difficulty and obviously managed to sort them all out in the end. And those people who go on a 10-day retreat and by day 8, day 9, they're counting the time till they leave. Lumpu Supa was in a different league. He was very much, you might call, old school, old-fashioned, being so old, literally. He practiced back in the early 1900s, 1920, 1930, which is a completely different era in Thailand where he lived. The majority of the country was forest, very undeveloped, very little urbanization. So he spent all his life wandering around the forests. And as he said, in his early years, he didn't have a passport. He wandered, and to wander from Thailand into Burma or Laos was quite normal, and monks would do it all the time. And there was no border checkpoint. You just walk from one bit of forest to the other. And he actually, at one point, walked all the way to India and spent time in northern India and then into what is now Pakistan, Afghanistan, but in those days they weren't called that. And then eventually to China and then back down through Laos, back into Thailand. So he was a monk who spent a lot of his time living very simply in forest environments, and started over 50 monasteries in his life. So initiated them and then would move on, eventually leaving other monks to run them, which in itself is a major feat and a great offering to the Buddhist religion. His teacher was a monk called Lumpu Suk, who many Thai Buddhists will have heard of. Famous, again, he lived 100 years ago, was practicing and was well known 100 years ago, even before our kind of great-grandfather Lumpu Man. Lumpu Suk was already well known in Thailand as a meditation master. And he had many students, and I met some of them. One was Lumpu Kram, who lived just down the road from Ajahn Kalyano. Another Lumpu Put, who lived not far away, and then Lumpu Supar. And they were like three Dhamma brothers, all students of Lumpu Suk, and famous for their skill in entering deep states of samadhi, Rupa Jhana and Arupa Jhana, which is very rare to find anybody who can do that. And Lumpu Suk himself was very famous for his psychic ability. And people love to talk about that side of the practice, and it does exist. So sometimes it's useful to have great masters who have mastered the mind, develop jhana and what we call abhinya, the psychic powers that come with jhana. And 100 years ago it was feasible to do that. The world was such a quiet, simple place that monks and even lay people sometimes could go off into retreats for long periods and develop deep states of samadhi. But Lumpu Supar in his teachings would always emphasize the Four Noble Truths, because he said that's what brings you to the end of suffering. And he didn't emphasize the development of jhana and psychic powers as much as developing insight into the Four Noble Truths. Nevertheless, everybody believed he had great psychic powers and jhana. It's one of the privileges of being a monk, is when you meet teachers like that, if you get to know them well, you do get to hear stories and hear about some of the lesser known parts of the practice and training of the mind. Whereas lay people often miss out because the monks' rules prevent us from talking about personal attainments and that kind of side of the mind. There's many, many stories that Lumpu Supar is famous for. But I was just thinking that day, it was the death anniversary of Lumpu Supar a couple of days ago, and then the snake came out and sat there in the sun. So it sort of reminded me of one of the most amazing stories about Lumpu Supar, his time when he was walking back from China. I think he was in Laos, staying in the forest. And one night he was meditating late at night, as he would. He would often meditate right into the deep, early hours of the morning. And while he was in samadhi, a large python came up from the forest to him and literally started to eat him as he was sitting there. And it started to swallow his feet. And the way they do it, they kind of gradually move up the feet, up the legs, and they start crushing your legs. I'm not speaking from experience here. I've never been swallowed by a python, but I have seen pythons swallow other things, and also Lumpur was able to talk about this experience. He said it was crushing his feet, particularly the ankle joints, became excruciatingly painful in the throat and then the stomach of this snake as it started to swallow him. They expand their mouths and crush you as they swallow you. That's the plan anyway. But it could only get so far up his legs. The snake probably wasn't big enough to swallow a whole human. And sometimes pythons take on more than they can cope with. So he came out of his samadhi because of the pain, which gives an indication of how deep in samadhi he was to start with. And he came out, and his legs are already in the mouth and stomach of this big python. But it's interesting, that would be a situation which most people would panic, wouldn't they, with fear. But Lumpur, because he had samadhi and wisdom, he didn't panic. He just summed up or surveyed the situation, sort of summed it up. This snake has got me. And then he talked to the snake and said, I've made a solemn vow to to follow the Buddhist path for the end of suffering, to attain rebirth in heaven and to attain Nibbana. That's my vow, that's my goal, and I've made that resolution very firm. So you can have my body. So he gave up attachment to his body. So you can have my body, but that means you have to take me to Nibbana as well, because I've made that adhitthana in my mind. And he said because the snake was unable to swallow further up his legs, I guess it's too difficult for it, it did actually start to regurgitate him and move backwards. I think it took some time, and it gradually released him and went back into the forest. And he said he was so worn out and in such pain from that experience, he had to lie down and rest. It was still in the night time. And he said his monk's robe and his feet were covered in slime from inside the snake's body, which was pretty horrible. But the worst thing was the pain he said just particularly his ankle joints were in pain. And the snake disappeared, and he was resting till dawn, because living on your own in the forest, your only way of getting food is to walk into the village. And he realized he needed to rest up because it would be painful walking, and he needed to walk in order to get alms, to get food. So he was resting, and he fell asleep at one point, and as he was waking up, he heard this loud voice, a woman's voice, scolding the snake. He couldn't see the snake, but he could hear the voice saying, "You evil snake, you've killed so many monks, you're not going to do it again." And then, not long after that, there was a crash, and a huge branch off a big forest tree fell down, and by chance it fell right on the snake and crushed the snake, killed the snake. So when he came out in the morning to go on alms round, he found this dead snake under the branch. So you can get many things from that story, but the main one is an awareness of just the sacrifice that forest monks go through, particularly in the old days when they had very little support, very little comfort and convenience, and they were exposed to all kinds of danger, like disease, wild animals, and so on. You say, what keeps them going in that situation? Well, it's the dedication to the path and the realization, cultivating the Eightfold Path and realizing the Four Noble Truths for Nibbana. And that literally is what he told the snake, but that's obviously what kept him going day after day in his practice in often very difficult circumstances. And it's not that Lumpur Supha was born perfect with a mind without any suffering, and life was easy for him in the robes. He was like anybody else. He had to encounter all kinds of pain and difficulty and challenges. But he said he kept his mind focused on that one goal, and that kind of draws you on and draws out the effort and the patience to put up with difficulties and to keep practicing whatever the mind throws up, whatever life throws up. As I said, Lumpur went on to build many monasteries. When I first met him, he was already 80 years old. I thought he was very old then, but he had an amazing meditation posture. I went to visit him with Lumpur Anan and in Phuket, in a monastery that he built on top of a hill. It's called a Little Hill Monastery. And he built a big Buddha on top of the hill, and underneath the Buddha there were a few rooms. Like it was built on a building, and he lived in one of those rooms, right under this enormous Buddha statue. And we had a good chat with him the first time I met him, and then he led us in meditation. He had this amazing meditation posture, really broad shoulders, really straight back, and he could sit for hours, whether it was in meditation or talking, and he was very comfortable within himself, no sense of suffering. He was very at ease with the world. He was already 80 years old and already experiencing, the pain of old age and some disease, but he never displayed any complaints or suffering with his aging, and he was still very bright eyes and very alert. And I assumed at that time he probably wouldn't live much longer. When you meet someone who's 80 years old, they're not going to live much longer. But he lived till he was 118. And we were talking about his monastery then. He'd just finished the big Buddha statue. And say, well, Lumpur, you've got a nice monastery here to spend the rest of your days as a monk. You're right on the coast, overlooking the coast, nice view of the sunset. And Phuket, now it's a tourist destination. And so he had prime real estate in the middle of a very expensive tourist island. So he said, oh, you've got a good spot here. And Lumpur just said, well, yeah, maybe, but I tend to move on in my life, so maybe it's not the last place I'll live. And we were sort of laughing about that. Who builds a new monastery when they're 80? And sure enough, in a few years' time after that, the Crown Princess of Thailand offered him a big piece of, again, prime real estate on the edge of Phuket city. And he moved down there and built another monastery, in his 90s. And then went to see him there. When I first started this monastery, he came to Melbourne, went to see him and invited him over to Australia. And he said, oh yeah, you've got a very beautiful location there. I've seen it already. So kind of raised my eyebrows, and he said, oh yes, I've been there with my mind, because with that level of psychic ability, you can actually do astral travel and all that. He said, I've seen it already, but I can't take my body there. The body is too weak. And he was by then physically much weaker. His eyes were going, his hearing was going. But I've seen it already, a very nice place, a good place to practice. Meanwhile, he was building a huge monastery around him. But that wasn't even the last monastery he lived in. He went on later to go back to his home village in northeast Thailand, Sakonnakhon, and build another monastery when he was over 100. So when people come and say they're too old to practice the Dhamma, I just quote Lumpur Supa. He was still building monasteries, meditating, teaching Dhamma until he was 118, literally till the end of his life. He didn't stop. So you're never too old to practice the Buddhist teachings. You're never too old to meditate. And there's proof of that. One time when he went to Bangkok for his eye surgery to get his cataracts done, he was old school. He never had a mobile phone with him or anything like that. But he was in the hospital, and the monks went up from Wat Map Jan to visit him, and he asked to borrow a mobile phone. And the monks asked why, and he said, I need to check on a few things in the monastery. So he rang back to his monastery, and they had a monastery phone in those days, and he had to talk to one of the monks and one of the nuns, because he had both monks and nuns living with him. And apparently while he was away, he'd been away for a few weeks up in Bangkok, and they'd been having arguments over different issues, how to run the monastery. And he hadn't been back, and no one had been to visit him, so they were both shocked that he knew all about this argument and what they'd been saying and what the details were, which again seemed to confirm what we all knew, that he often was able to know many things far beyond the reaches of his physical body. He could know what was going on back in his monastery and how people were practicing, and then he could present it to them so they really couldn't wriggle out of it. He could say, why did you say that? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? Which is how the Buddha encouraged monks to use psychic abilities, to teach people out of compassion, to help them see their own defilements, their own attachments. And when someone points them out that way, then you really fall into line, and you have to admit with a certain humility, he really knows. So sometimes he would teach in that way. But it's always for helping people on their path to the end of suffering. And we'd, in his later years, visit him, ask him, how is he feeling? And he'd just say, there's a bit of dukkha, a bit of pain, physical pain, discomfort. But it's just dukkha. It's just dukkha arising, passing away. He'd say it in a very nonchalant way, casual way, because that's the result of spending a lifetime studying the Four Noble Truths and putting them into practice. It doesn't free you from the experience of dukkha, dukkha of the body, dukkha of the mind, but it gives you the right attitude. You understand dukkha is something just to be known, and it's just part of the human experience. And it was I always thought when he talked about dukkha, like he'd have extreme pain in his body. When you're over 100, your joints, your muscles give you lots of pain. He was almost blind, almost deaf. He had various diseases coming up, but he never displayed any discomfort or dissatisfaction with his body and his age, and all the teaching he had to do and meet people. He was still kind and compassionate to do that, but he never complained. And I always thought when he was talking about his own personal dukkha, it's all very much like just a fly or an insect that kind of lands on you that may be a little bit irritating, but then it flies away and it's really not a big deal. He would talk about quite serious physical ailments and conditions in the same way. No big deal, it's just a bit of dukkha. And this is how the Buddha encouraged us to reflect on dukkha, just to know it for what it is, but not create any suffering, further suffering out of our experience of pain, disappointment, whatever goes on in life that brings us dukkha, physical or mental. Just treat it for what it is. It's just dukkha. It's just what it is. And you just kind of flick it off. You don't dwell on it. You don't create anything more than it is. You don't make it a focus of self-identity. You don't become that pain. And that's the aim of the practice. So when you meet someone who's done that and done it very well, you get to see the living practice of knowing dukkha as dukkha, but not attaching to it or suffering because of the painful, unpleasant experiences that life brings us, but just knowing them for what they are and then letting go. And this is the flavour of the Buddhist practice. You practice knowing dukkha and then understanding its cause is craving and attachment, and the cause is to be abandoned, to be let go. And that really is the sum total of the Buddhist path. Although we have many tools and reflections and practices to help us do that, in its essence it's knowing dukkha as dukkha, knowing craving, attachment as the cause of dukkha, and letting go. And the path of practice that leads to the end of dukkha, cessation, is just learning how to let go. And that flavour, the flavour of letting go, runs through all the teachings the Buddha gave. It's all giving us ways and means to let go. Some dukkha, like the dukkha of a physical body, especially when you get to 100 years old, like Lumpu, you can't distract yourself from it, you can't escape from it, but you can mentally know it and let it go. And what we tend to do, especially when we're younger, is just avoid it. We distract ourselves from dukkha. We find things that bring us more pleasant, stimulating experiences so that we don't have to know about dukkha. We can hide from it, deny it, escape from it, cover it over, blot it out, become intoxicated with other things, literally. Often we just drink or take drugs to get rid of our dukkha. We absorb into all kinds of different activities to escape from dukkha, but that's not knowing dukkha, that's running away from it. So the drawback of all those ways of escaping and distracting ourselves from dukkha is that the distraction only lasts so long, and then you're back to square one with the dukkha, and often you've done things which create more dukkha in the process. And often you're doubling down on your dukkha and making it worse as you go along. So the Buddha's way is not to run away from it. It's actually to look and learn from it and know it. So dukkha is to be known, comprehended for what it is. So it doesn't sound correct. Who would make dukkha known to themselves when you can still run away from it? Why not just run away? So we do, but the way out of dukkha is actually getting to know it. And immediately that diminishes its power over the mind. Because any form of pain, suffering, it takes hold of the mind, and when we're not very aware, we just become suffering. That's who we are. And if that keeps happening, if we keep meeting dukkha without awareness, without really contemplating or knowing it, well, we get that feeling it's the same old dukkha, and it's the same, it's always the same. So it naturally drags our mind down to a sense of depression, disappointment, sadness. And we can escape for small periods by seeking the opposite of dukkha, which is sukha, happiness, pleasure. But happiness and pleasure doesn't last. It's there as an experience and then it fades. And then there's dukkha again. And then you go back to that same sort of pattern of saying, oh, it's always the same. Things never improve, things never get better, it's always me. One of the parts of dukkha is we attach to it when we're not aware, we're not mindful, we're not reflecting, we attach to it with a sense of self. So we say, this is me, I am dukkha. So my life is always like this, it's always bad. And we just keep looking for things to back up that view. So it's almost like we're looking for dukkha to reinforce the view that life is dukkha, and we just get stuck into it, a bit like getting stuck in the mud. Whereas the Buddha encouraged us to develop more awareness, mindfulness and wisdom, to contemplate it, develop wisdom to see, well, there is dukkha as part of our life, but dukkha can be known. And the causes of dukkha, the craving, the attachment, the unawareness, can be abandoned, can be let go. So if you meet some of these old monks, they're just proving it can be done, and they're proving it over and over again. It's like a real blessing to have a 118-year-old monk in the world. Obviously he's gone now, but when he was alive. So it's like 109 years in the robes, just proving that dukkha can be known, craving and attachment can be abandoned, there is a way out of suffering. Living proof. And sometimes we need that. It's a blessing to meet such teachers. But we have to follow their example. That's what they would encourage us to do. And someone like Luang Por, who's lived in the world for a whole century and more, practicing the Dhamma, he'd just say, there's nothing in this world that will bring you lasting happiness, sukha. It's all very fleeting. Don't just run away from dukkha and try and fill your mind with sukha. It doesn't work. He'd say, contemplate the Four Noble Truths, really to come to see them and know them for yourself. That's the way out of suffering. So remembering teachers like this, say on his death anniversary, it can be a boost. Rather than being with the sadness of separation, you recollect teachers with joy at their lives and the practice that they've done, and you can take on the qualities that they embody and that they developed in their practice. You can aspire to develop the same qualities, to emulate them. Dedicate your life to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, to the practice of the Eightfold Noble Path, realization of the Four Noble Truths. This is what made teachers like Luang Por Supha great teachers. And you also, if you just keep practicing, keep doing it, you will become a great teacher. Not that you're doing it for that, but it's just natural, isn't it? If you practice following the Eightfold Noble Path every day, become used to developing mindfulness, you turn the suffering of your life, the pain, the difficulties and suffering, into something useful. Even suffering has a value because it brings us to mindfulness and wisdom to let go of attachment, which is what leads to suffering. You're letting go of that attachment through your practice. So getting to know suffering brings some value, something useful to suffering. Even pain can be a useful teacher. So Ajahn Chah used to call suffering the Ajahn Dukkha. Here comes Ajahn Dukkha to teach me. If you have the right mindset, the right attitude, your suffering will teach you and it will bring you wisdom, understanding. So maybe tonight I'll just leave you with those reflections, and we can celebrate the life of Luang Por Supha, another very well practiced monk who dedicated his life to the Buddhist path. And may the life of Luang Por Supha and the memory of him be a blessing for us all. May it bring us all closer to the end of suffering, to Nibbana.